So, good morning. Well, for me, it's morning. I'm in the US. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abel Gutierrez, and I am a grad student currently attending UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina. I'm thrilled to be here presenting over the Vox, and this is still a work in progress, so I do appreciate hearing any questions or critiques after this particular presentation. And so my presentation today is Whose Flesh is Weak? Analyzing racialized and gendered socio-technical imaginaries through the Adeptus Mechanicus. During this presentation, I'll be utilizing the praxis of the Adeptus Mechanicus to highlight the relationship between contemporary socio-technical desires for human progress and development, and how these imaginaries reify a system of human and inhuman delineations which are highly gendered and racialized. Drawing from in-universe lore as well as community discourse, I intend not only to spotlight the embedded colonial and imperial logics that inform Mechanicus narrative assemblage, but also how attempts to rectify and avoid this attachment only further naturalizes the presence and influence of these ideologically biased structures. Ultimately, this presentation isn't focused on proving that the Mechanicus are racist or sexist. The relation between the 40K universe and British colonial history is very much on its sleeve, but instead utilizes Mechanicus as an object of critical and cultural analysis that allows us to make sense of contemporary technical imaginaries that invisibilize the traditional signifiers attached to systems of colonial and imperial power to maintain these systems within the 21st century. So let me click this. Okay. So, however, before we discuss the body of the presentation, I will provide a brief background for the Mechanicus for those of us who avoid the Imperium's propaganda. Now, the Adeptus Mechanicus, or the cult Mechanicus as they are known, are in essence techno-zealots that conform to a Malarianism which conflates notions of human life, progress, and survival with an intense techno-religiosity, a belief that the golden age of humanity is behind us, but is potentially replicatable, I can't say words, through the divinity imbued within the machine god's technological instruments and related extermination of weak, corruptible flesh. In fact, while the faction's engagement in techno-intimacy is one of its most defining traits, both within the lore and community engagement, specifically I reference the fact that the faction and its fan base refer to themselves as toaster fuckers, the central identity of the cult Mechanicus is as much about their love for technology as it is their absolute disdain for biological organisms. This thematic runs through various aspects of the faction's identity, from the body horror aesthetic where tech priests tear away their own or others' flesh to be replaced with pure technology, to the rhetoric espoused in popular community texts, such as the very infamous monologue from Warhammer 40K Mechanicus. However, these narratives about the limitations of our biological shells and both the secular and spiritual ascension of the human through technological extension finds real-world relevance within contemporary tech ideologies such as post and transhumanism, which believe that human nature is a work in progress and can be improved through the often literal bodily intervention of technology. Yet these narratives frequently ignore broader colonial imaginaries that justify the objectification and extermination of subaltern populations as necessary sacrifices for this better humanity, guising the fact that terms such as flesh, bodies, and humans have never been universal in significance, but rather discursive technologies which reify divisions between divinely created to be rational humans and divinely created to be irrational animals. Ultimately, despite the 41st millennium's construction within a post-raced and gendered society, the continued presence of these racialized and gendered logics highlights how, as Zakiya Iman Jackson states, the ongoing production and nullification of Black matter remains the primary organizing principle within which the world, fictional or not, maintains its coherence. To better present the relationship between the Mechanicus, the narrative of flesh, and contemporary and historical systems of power, I have constructed three central themes that situate the ontological and epistemological foundations of the Adeptus Mechanicus within these oppressive logics, that being the figure of the heretic, the servitor, and the xenos. So to begin, I would like to dissect the Mechanicus narration of the weakness of flesh in relation to the figure of the heretic, whose corrupt, inhuman nature is often visually represented through the amalgamated flesh of the spawn, the accursed, and the possessed. However, while chaos corruption is often depicted as a physical malady, it's as much a corruption of the body as it is the mind, with the creeping influence of the chaos gods manipulating lesser organisms to enact their destructive will on society. Within this context, the flesh comes to signify not only a literal material weakness, i.e., steel being tougher than muscle, but also a psychic vulnerability, a fragility that originates from the inherent sinful nature of the human condition. As a result, the figure of the heretic as the inhuman other relates to various iterations of Sylvia Wynter's descriptive statements of man, specifically the Latin Christian European conception of the non-white, non-European population as a form of post-Adamic fallen humanity, whose flesh is tainted by the act of original sin and therefore incapable of accessing an intimate knowledge of the divine. However, with the invention of race as an organizing hierarchical principle, the purity of spirit rematerializes into a purity of blood, highlighting the biological impossibility for Black others to exist within the world of rational humans due to their biologically innate irrationality. Through the figure of the heretic, the Mechanicus disdain of flesh comes to reflect the racialized and colonial logics which establish the delineation between human and inhuman, or in this case, human and post-human, through their greater capacity for rational thought, a thought which is seated within Judeo-Christian Enlightenment era ideologies, where irrationality and biological weaknesses were always already racialized, and maintain their narrative cohesiveness through their attachment to the taint of Black flesh. These colonial imaginaries persist within contemporary post and transhumanist narratives, which position the post-human as superior in both virtue, and knowledge production, compared to the limited intellectual capacity of non-augmented organisms, shifting the boundaries of prescribed humanists from religious to biological to technological grounds. Therefore, while the Mechanicus do not directly racialize the flesh and bodies they absolutely despise, the logical systems which organize their disdain have always already situated the flesh as belonging to corrupted Black matter, whose purpose is to legitimize dominant population's superior position through their natural lack. These fleshy bodies can only manifest not only through these fleshy bodies' value can only manifest not through the enactment of their own agency, as the heretics' attempt to enact their own will upon the world literally results in the manifestations of devils, but rather through the proper agency granted by the superior and divine post and transhumans. Now, despite their disdain for the biological subject, the presence of flesh remains a valuable tool for the continued operation and expansion of the Mechanicus influence. Specifically, this usefulness is evident in the relationship between the cult Mechanicus and its loyal servitor workforce. Lobotomized, cut up, and technologically augmented, millions upon millions of servitors and Scutari make up the backbone of the Mechanicus' daily and wartime operations, with the flesh needed to maintain this massive workforce sourced from various populations across the 40K universe, such as indentured servants, gangs, prisoners, willing volunteers, and mass flesh farms. For the Mechanicus, it matters not where the flesh flows, as long as it can be exploited to reach humanity's greater post-humanist purpose. However, I would argue that it does matter where the flesh flows, as a common thematic for the figure of the servitor is its embedded position within class relations, specifically the more obvious fact that the Mechanicus collection and processing of a servitor mirrors existing institutions and structures which operate to collect and discipline subaltern subjects. For example, the Mechanicus, while narrating the procurement of flesh as an indiscriminate process, distinctly sources their servitors from lower social economic classes, such as the prisoner, the servant, the diasporic peoples, with these specific populations historically constituted of subaltern subjects. These dehumanizing disciplinary systems divorcing these subjects from their human bodies and instead reclassifying them as material flesh. Therefore, the bodily agency assigned to the subaltern subject is in existence as a prime commodity of exchange, with their only potential use being the sacrifice of their flesh to the machinations of their post-human counterparts, with perhaps the most notable example of this being the fact that a variety of Mechanicus war machines literally consume the flesh of its servitor operator to function efficiently. These narratives are not only present within colonial history, i.e., the belief that enslaved Africans were better off as slaves due to their natural inferiority and therefore would do good in the world through their subjugated positions, but also underlie modern socio-technical imaginaries around tech development and human progression, with the desires and strifes of lower-class biological humans, such as issues of racism, misogyny, and sexism, considered insignificant and negligent in the face of post and transhumanist development. Taking this analysis a step further, the Mechanicus's disciplining of fleshy bodies must also take into consideration how the presence or absence of affective connections plays a role in the delineation of human and inhuman populations, namely how a denial of desire operates to exclude subaltern populations from discussions of human futurity. Namely, in reference to Sarah Ahmed, emotionality becomes the moniker for the persistence of primitivism within present subjects, specifically those who are women and people of color, whose emotionality serves as a reminder of their subordinate faculties in relation to white men's affinity for thought and reason. In consideration of the lobotomization of the servitor, the removal of the servitor's emotionality not only allows for its more ideal functionality due to its removed perceived weakness, a weakness that, mind you, is effectively attached to labels of blackness and femininity, but also reinforces the non-value attributed to the imaginations of subaltern populations. Again, we return to this delineation between human, inhuman, and post-human through their capacity for knowledge construction, as the only significant difference between the tech priest and the servitor is not access to technological enhancements, but rather to capacity to properly utilize these enhancements towards a particular teleological end. This assertion directly challenges post and transhumanist ideologies, which perceive that the primary issue for post-human development is one of material access. However, what the figure of the servitor conveys is not a matter of access to technology, but rather the attribution of value to said technology through its relationship with particular bodies and affects. Moreover, in divorcing race and gender from class relations, the rhetoric of the Adeptus Mechanicus only further naturalized these attributions of value, guising the role of race and gender within the unjust operations of capitalist systems, characterizing the horrible fate of the servitor as an equally potential position for all bodies, rather than highlighting its more likely unilateral effect upon marginalized populations. As a final thematic element relating to the Adeptus Mechanicus lore, I look at the hostile relationship between the Mechanicus and Xenos factions, highlighting a vital question introduced in the previous: who gets to be post-human? For instance, let's consider the notable rivalry between the Adeptus Mechanicus and their evil Xenos equivalent, the Necron dynasties. The relationship between these two factions echoes the logic of British colonialism, with Mechanicus exploratory fleets raiding and claiming Necron planets, which is then met by the hostilities of a non-human indigenous population that is narrated as unequivocally evil and demands the extinction of the human race. This relationship is further complicated by the fact that the Necrons, as a faction, are inspired by and are a reflection of their Warhammer fantasy equivalent, the Tomb Kings. Specifically, it is the fact that the Tomb Kings, an evil undead faction of zombies and inhuman constructs, tainted by the original sin of Nagash, are one of, if not the only unique factions from fantasy Africa. And while the Necron situation within the sci-fi genre attempts to address some of these more blatant problematics that connect the undead tainted flesh to notions of blackness, the colonial logics that underlay their relation to the Mechanicus not only reinforce who gets to be post-human, but also constructs the other as a permanent and ever-growing threat that will inevitably succeed in its evil machinations, lest we make the necessary sacrifices to ensure our continued way of life. Xenos races such as the Necrontyr, despite sharing both a post-humanist or transhumanist subjectivity and somewhat similar ideology with the Adeptus Mechanicus, are positioned as a dark mirror, as a hostile other that, despite sharing many of the same attributes, are narrated as being perverse abominations that have improperly reached a transhuman state and therefore incapable of divine existence. Again, we find that it is not the technology itself that possesses the divine virtue, but rather the bodies it becomes attached to. In this example, the Xeno stands in for the subaltern third world subject, whose existence threatens white Western civilization. Additionally, even when these subjects adopt the material and discursive elements of the post-human, they do not have the capacity to actually better society, but rather utilize these extensions to ruin or corrupt the natural state of the world. I point to the fact that the Necron's post-human transcendence results in the largest galactic war in the history of war, or the Eldar's advanced technological society birthing a literal chaos god. And while you can point to the Horus Heresy as an example of the Imperium's similar failure, it is also essential to recognize how the Horus Heresy isn't necessarily narrated as the result of overzealous greed or power or pleasure like the Xenos races, but rather a result of an external evil influence that turns the Imperium against itself. Returning to the previous section's discussion of post and transhumanism and the issue of material access, the figure of the Xenos helps demonstrate that inherently flawed logic, which situates the post-human as a homogeneous collective that transcends oppressive or racialized and gendered divisions due to its transcendental state, but instead reiterates that even in the perceived absence of its traditional signifiers, these logics persist, whether it's in our favorite media or our own ideological affiliations. In conclusion, I hope this presentation highlights the significance of critically analyzing popular media such as Warhammer 40k and other similar narratives to emphasize how such media both shape and reflect ideological structures that, while entertaining at the level of the parodic, always possess the potential to spill over and naturalize the presence of oppressive structures within our everyday operations and relations. I love Warhammer 40,000. But while I see my white colleagues imagine themselves as the tech priest, the space marine, the rogue trader, I realize that the only value my flesh possesses in the 41st millennium would be dissolving away in the cockpit of a dune crawler. Thank you.